Okay, in this lesson, we're going to talk about the dynamic Earth, or as it's commonly called, or in geology, plate tectonics. And in this, what we're going to try and do, as shown in this particular photograph or image, we've got volcanic activity in the upper left corner. We've got buildings falling down as a result of earthquakes in the lower left. And on the right, tidal wave activity and that. So these three things may look as though they're quite separate and distinct. But what I'm going to try and do here is show you how these are all linked together. The notion of continents moving was first articulated in 1914 by Alfred Wegener when he proposed the idea of continental drift. Basically, his suggestion was that the continents that we see on the Earth's crust today were, in fact, at one time, all part of a much larger continent, and that with time they split apart and they had drifted apart. He had based his idea on the similarity of the coastlines between South Africa and South America, and the fact that you could fit those together, and also, as we'll see, the similarity in the fossil plants and animals on those two continents. The problem that Wegener faced with this was at that time, 1914, there were no maps of the ocean floor that showed all the details that we see today, and hence he didn't include that in his theory. So people criticized it because they could not picture or explain how these continental masses would move apart. First of all, we're going to look and show the basic information that he used to come up with the idea of continental drift, and then we'll look at how it's evolved from that time. So we're going to show this short movie here and see what happens. Now, one of the important things to notice here is that, first of all, the tight fit between the South America and Africa seems unlikely that that could have happened just by pure chance. But also note here that the match is not on the basis of the coastlines themselves, but is based on the edge of what we call the continental shelf. Around each continent on most coastline, you have a stretch of shallow water before it goes into the deep water. If you look at this map, look at the dark blue, which represents the deep oceans to the west of South America and the east of Africa, and you'll notice there are a few small patches of that dark blue color between Africa and South America, but overall the fit is rather amazing. He added to this by looking at the geology of the two continents. This is greatly simplified. The gray areas are indicating rocks of the same type. The black lines that are on these continents indicate trends and mountain chains and other things. And when you look at that, you'll see, for example, that the gray areas match between South Africa and South America. And also when you look at the black lines, they seem to trend and follow the same trend from one continent to the other. He also looked at fossil evidence, and for this purpose, he looked at South America, Africa, India, Madagascar, Antarctica, and Australia. And you notice here what has been done is all these continents have been pulled together, and you notice how they all fit together. The reason that you see some blue between the different continents is simply so you can see the shape. You can actually fit them all together very clearly. And then if you look at the different types of fossils, The Cygonatus, for example, you find in South America and Africa, and you notice how the trends for their distribution join together. If you look at plant leaves, such as Glossopteris, you can trace that from Australia to Antarctica, into India, Madagascar, Africa, and South America. They all follow the same trend. That the fact that you can do that is also suggestive that these continents were together. Wegener suggests this, and he coined the term for this as a supercontinent, called it Gondwana land. He also looked at evidence of glacial deposits, late Paleozoic, is hundreds of million years ago. But if we look at the rocks on these continents, you can tell when there's been periods of glaciation, and you can also determine the direction of ice movement. And again, if you look up at the upper right corner, you can see how continents come together and how that you can visualize one large ice cap on those continents. As I mentioned at the outset, his ideas were not originally accepted because they had no information on the seafloor, and therefore really had trouble explaining how this would happen. In effect, he said the continents simply drifted apart, almost like you had pieces of wood floating on water that separated. And because the oceans were not included in his ideas were kind of put aside, and a lot of people did not believe them. With the advent of mapping of the oceans, both from satellites and other mechanisms, we now have a very detailed picture of the oceans. And what you find, in fact, that is of critical importance for this discussion is that all of these oceans have what we call mid-oceanic ridges. So in the right-hand map, if you start at the north in Iceland, you can see a structure that is flowing down, goes through the central part of the North Atlantic, continues down through the central part of the South Atlantic. In the lower left corner, this is showing a model of what the seafloor looks like. The blue in that lower left corner is the deep water. The darker orange is the shallow water. In effect, these are mountain chains. So if you started in the lower left corner on the map, you'd actually climb up, reach the top of that ridge, which is dark orange, and then go back down into shallow water. If you were to go on that ridge at the top there, it's not actually a solid ridge. You actually have a valley that cuts down that ridge. This structure can be followed all the way around in these things. And in fact, if you start at Iceland, you can follow that mid-oceanic ridge. It goes all the way down North Atlantic, South Atlantic, goes around the southern part of Africa, joins in the ridge that cuts across the Indian Ocean. That then joins another ridge that goes across the Pacific Ocean. In effect, it's the longest chain of mountains in the world. We don't call them mountains because they're underwater.
It happened because hot rock rises, heated by the Earth's core. Near the surface, the rock spreads in two directions and goes sideways. It begins to lose heat. Eventually, the much cooler rock sinks back down. Through this spreading process, the Earth's crust is very slowly dragged apart, and it's this that ultimately causes the continents to move. Where the plates collide, the rock on the seafloor containing carbon from the dead plankton is carried deep into the Earth. As it descends, this layer of rock is heated, so the rock melts, releasing carbon dioxide. And gas is returned back into the atmosphere during an eruption. The remarkable cycle is complete.
So what that movie showed was that the magma is coming up in these ridges in the center of the ocean, pushing the ocean floor apart, and that pushes the continents apart. If you go into Iceland, which is, you can see in the northern part of the Atlantic, you go to a place called Þingvellir. You have to understand that the Icelandic language has 4 extra letters than we use. I probably, the pronunciation there, I won't guarantee it's correct. But what is interesting about this location is that you go there, and this is where one of these oceanic ridges actually comes on land, and you can see it. It's really about the only place in the world where you can see this. And here you see from this aerial view, there is a valley. That's the valley in which the magma would come up. And this is ridge here and ridge here. This on the right-hand, upper right-hand side is moving away from the central valley. The left-hand side here, that material is being pushed away from the central valley, but in the opposite direction from the other side. So this is where the spreading center is coming. So the upper part's moving off to the northeast, the lower part's moving off to the southwest. And that's what's pushing the continents apart. If we were to come back to this location in a few million years, we'd probably find that Iceland has been split in two, and you've got oceanic water in the area. If you go to the southern part of Iceland, there's this rather strange looking bridge, and you wonder why a bridge would be there. There's no water, land on either side. The reason they put in there is it's a tourist attraction, because from a tectonic point of view, the landmass on the left side of that image is part of the European place, whereas land on the right-hand side is part of the North American place. So the claim is here that this is the only place in the world where you can cross from Europe to North America via a bridge. It's a tourist trap. It drives the point home. Here is the central valley, and you can see the black material. This is all volcanic material. When you get periodic eruptions, then this is where that volcanic material forms.
The Earth's magnetic field acts as a shield, protecting our planet from much of the sun's dangerous radiation. But in 1906, a French geologist named Bernard Bruns made a startling discovery about the field. Bruns was examining newly formed volcanic rocks near a lava flow in central France. Lava from a volcano contains minerals from deep inside the Earth. Inside the molten lava, iron particles are free to move. But as the flow begins to cool and form into rocks, the iron particles align themselves according to the Earth's magnetic field, like a compass. They become a fossilized snapshot of the Earth's magnetic field in action. But during his research, Bruns found some of the rocks contained iron particles that were magnetized in the opposite direction. Their compass needle had flipped, pointing south instead of north. This was the moment of discovery. Bruns realized that at some point in the past, the Earth's magnetic field had changed direction and reversed itself. It was a significant discovery. It meant that Earth was a far more dynamic planet than many had imagined, constantly changing. We can see that the Earth's magnetic field has reversed about 60 times in the last 20 million years. That's once every couple 100,000 years or so. And we may be going through a reversal right now because the Earth's magnetic field has decreased in strength about 10% in only the last century and a half. Now, no one's exactly sure why this happens, but Bruns' discovery does raise a provocative question. what happens when the Earth's magnetic field goes to zero? The answer may lie on Mars. Scientists have detected that the red planet once may have had a magnetic field, powered by a furnace-like core, just like the one on Earth. But at some point in its past, the heat source of the Mars core was extinguished. Without its internal furnace, the planet died. Its magnetic field disappeared, and harmful cosmic and solar rays bombarded the planet, wiping out any chance for life as we know it. Could that happen here? Well, the composition and size of the Earth's core is such that the Earth will probably stay hot inside for billions of years.
So the idea is explained there is the idea that the magnetic field of the Earth has changed through time. So if you'd have been in present day, we call it the period of normal magnetism. When it flipped over and the magnetic pole was in the South Pole, we would say that's reverse. If we look at this model, which shows the volcano with the layers of rock, the volcanic rocks in, you can see from the arrows that they point in one direction for one period, the other direction the other. This is as they what we call the flipping or flip through time of the magnetic pole. The direction of the magnetic field gets frozen or set in the rock once it's cooled down below 580 degrees Celsius for magnetite. If we were to heat that rock up again, it would lose that direction. But this is the idea. You cool a rock, the iron particles line to the Earth's magnetic field. You can go to various places. For example, in India, we've got vast deposits of volcanic rocks. Go into the Columbia River flood basalts. Flood basalt is formed as magma comes out, floods across a wide area, and solidifies, forms a rock called basalt. If we look at this, note here, the dark purple here represents a period of normal magnetic time as we are today. The light blue represents a period of a reversed magnetic field. One of the important things to note here, if you look at the column on the left, is, which is against time, millions of years before present, the lengths of time represented by each period of normal magnetism and reverse magnetism are highly variable. Sometimes they're short-lived, sometimes they're long-lived, and that also greatly complicates the explanation of why this process happens. One of the interesting things is that if we now go back to the ocean floor, and we're going to go back to just south of Iceland, remembering what I showed you of what's happening on land in Iceland. And if we look in the map in the lower right corner, it shows the ridge and the axis. That's that valley we talked about at the top of the ridge. And what I want you to imagine is that in that ridge, magma is coming up. And as the magma comes up, it pushes the plates apart in different directions. These different colors here that show periods of reversal and normal magnetism. They are colored according to their age. So what you notice here is the color, this sort of reddish brown color here on one side matches that on the other side of the ridge. And you can match all these colors together. Again, this indicates that the material is being produced in the axis of the ridge, pushing the plates apart. If we start in Iceland, which is up in the upper right corner of this map, the black line shows the spreading center, and you can see it goes all the way through North Atlantic, South Atlantic, around Africa, into the Indian Ocean, into the Pacific Ocean, all the way across. It's continuous. And the colors that are associated with that, you don't worry about the units are there, but the different colors represent different type or different strengths of the paleomagnetism, and you can see that it follows all the way around these things. This is important because this is what helps us to explain what we call plate tectonics. This is the information that Wegener lacked when he was trying to push the idea of continental drift. There is a problem that when you're trying to visualize this, and the problem that complicates it is we're not dealing with the geometry on a flat surface. You're dealing with geometry on a globe. And anytime you start dealing with geometrical issues on a curved surface, it becomes extremely complicated, simply because you're dealing with different dimensions. If you look at the diagram on the right-hand side, you can see that the ridge, that high point on that diagram, is offset from one to the other. And if you look at the blue arrows, which indicate the direction of movement of the plates, you can see that in some parts they are parallel, in other parts they are opposite. And you notice that in the center part between the two ridges, that's where we get the opposing direction of plate movement. That has to happen in order to account for the curvature of the Earth's surface. That's what is called a transform fault. When you look at the map of, for example, the South Atlantic, you can see where the ridge is. It's that light-colored line that goes all the way through the center of the ocean. And if you look at that very carefully, you'll see that different segments of that ridge are offset from each other. There are lines that go across the ocean. Those are the transform faults. They have to exist because of the geometry involved. We can actually see one of these faults, the San Andreas fault, which is on the west coast of North America. We get the East Pacific rise, a spreading center comes in, and then we get a series of transform faults that go all the way up the west coast of North America. The San Andreas fault is shown on the right-hand side. It's an aerial view of it. That gash in the Earth's surface is the fault. And it's famous, of course, because in 1908, San Francisco was devastated by an earthquake, massive earthquake triggered by this fault. The earthquakes occur because as this fault is moving, you've got one side of the land mass moving in one direction, the other side moving in the opposite direction. Sometimes the movement gets stopped, the rocks get jammed up, pressure is still there, pressure will build up, and eventually the fault will fail, and there'll be a sudden, rapid movement, and that is what triggers the earthquakes. For example, San Francisco, the earthquake devastated that city, was one of the largest earthquakes known. It was significant. So to remind you what's happening here, we're going to go back to the movie that we saw before.
It happened because hot rock rises, heated by the Earth's core. Near the surface, the rock spreads in two directions and goes sideways. It begins to lose heat. Eventually, the much cooler rock sinks back down. Through this spreading process, the Earth's crust is very slowly dragged apart. And it's this that ultimately causes the continents to move. Where the plates collide, the rock on the seafloor containing carbon from the dead plankton is carried deep into the Earth. As it descends, this layer of rock is heated, so the rock melts, releasing carbon dioxide. And gas is returned back into the atmosphere during an eruption. The remarkable cycle is complete.
So if we look at this and go back to this map, the yellow lines show the traces of the mid-oceanic ridges. The red dots on here show the locations of volcanoes, and the black line with the little triangles indicate what we call the subduction zone. You'll notice here that most of the volcanoes are located around the shorelines of the ocean. So, for example, if you look at the Pacific, most of the volcanoes are in the coastal areas. Likewise, if you look at what we call the subduction zone, that's where the oceanic material or the oceanic plate is being pushed back underground or below the continental material. That it's also in these coastal areas. It's not by accident that these patterns happen. And you'll notice, think about it, if you ask yourself the question, where is the deepest oceanic water known in the world? Well, it's not in the center of the ocean. It's in the coastal areas. So, for example, the Marianas Trench, which is close to the coastal area of Asia. If you go off the west coast of South America, very, very deep water. Think back to the movie that was just shown. That is where the plates have been pushed back down underneath the continents. It's also the plates, as you push that plate back down underneath the continent, the rock is melting. And because it's melting, that's where you get the volcanoes. If you look for the examples of the major earthquakes that have affected the areas, most of the really big, bad earthquakes are associated with this subduction zone. So the ones off the coast of Japan, for example, which happened some years ago, major earthquakes. South America, on the west coast of South America, major earthquakes. That's caused by the subduction plate or the oceanic plate being pushed down beneath the continental plate. That style of earthquake is very different from the earthquake that affected Los Angeles many years ago. So, as I already mentioned, but I'm going to emphasize the deep oceanic trenches around the marginal areas of the ocean seems counterintuitive because you might think that the deepest water has to be in the center of the ocean. That's not the case. Mariana Trench is 10,911 meters deep. It's shown by the red dot on this map. So here's the cross section through one of these subduction zones to help you visualize it. You can see we've got what's called the asthenosphere, the upper mantle, and the oceanic crust. Oceanic crust is being pushed down beneath the continental crust. It's melted to form magma. Magma comes up to produce the volcanoes. Where this oceanic crust is being pushed down underneath and being subducted, it forms a trench, which is the deepest part of the oceans. It's important that you understand the difference between the concept of continental drift as proposed by Wegener and the notion of plate tectonics. The single most important thing to remember is that when Wegener produced his ideas, he only dealt with the continent. So it was African, just the continent of Africa was moving. South America was moving. So he just looked at the land areas. Because remember, he did not have the information on the seafloor. With plate tectonics, each plate can include land. So, for example, if you look at the African plate, so it includes the African continent, but it also includes parts of the seafloor. In this case, parts of the South Atlantic seafloor, part of the Indian Ocean seafloor, and it can also include transform faults. So these plates are more complicated, but they include all the key elements of the plate tectonics. Though that information which I've just given you is summarized in this diagram. It shows you the divergent plates, where the plates are being pushed apart by the volcanic activity on the oceanic ridges. We've got convergent or margins, that is where the plates are coming together again, the oceanic plate being pushed down beneath the continental plate. And then we've got the boundaries of the transform faults, where different parts of the Earth's crust are sliding past each other. We think that this, in effect, is driven by convection in the Earth itself. So if you look at a pot of boiling water and watch it very carefully, you can actually see the water moving around in circles as a function of the heat that's being applied to it. In the simplest sense, that is what is happening with the Earth. We've got magma being heated at depth. Magma comes up, pushes the plates apart. Plates move apart, and they get subducted back into the Earth, and they start melting. In the case of the Cayman Islands, how does this affect it? Cayman Islands are part of the Caribbean. It's one of the most complex areas to deal with from a tectonic point of view. Again, what you have to understand is you're dealing with curved surfaces. You cannot just have a whole series of big plates and they all neatly fit together again. What happens is big plates come together, but they always leave small areas where the Earth has to sort of compensate and deal with it. And that's what's happened here. To the north, you've got the North American plate, and what happened through time is the Pacific plate brought in the crustal area, formed the isthmus here to block it off. Plate hit North American plate and then got pushed away. So here you see Grand Cayman, Little Cayman, and Cayman Brac, located in the center of this area. This gets particularly complicated because off the southeast corner of Grand Cayman, you have the mid-Cayman rise. It's a spreading center. It's active today. It's been filmed to show the activity. And so what we get here is on the right-hand side of that rise, the land is being pushed to the east. On the left-hand side, the seafloor is being pushed to the west. That sharp boundary here between the really deep water and the ridge on which the islands sit, that is a transform fault. That transform fault is important because, as this image here shows it, the spreading center, the Orient Transform Fault, Cayman Ridge. That's important because those transform faults are where most of the earthquakes are located. That's why you get a lot of earthquakes on Grand Cayman. Some of them are triggered by activity on that spreading center. Most of them are triggered by movement on the Orient fracture or transform fault. It's not clear why you get different densities of earthquakes. So all these red dots represent what we call the epicenter of an earthquake. A lot of them located around Grand Cayman. There's no red dots over Cayman Brac and Little Cayman. They very rarely feel the earthquakes. You do feel them here on Grand Cayman. A lot of them in Jamaica, a lot in southern Cuba. But the reason why you get the earthquakes here is simply because of the plate tectonics. You can actually go on the United States Geological Survey website, and they keep records of all the earthquakes that occur around the world. If you go on that site, you can search and find the Cayman Islands, and it will tell you, keeps a record of all the earthquakes that affected the islands. So, for example, on the right-hand side of the slide, it provides you with a list of when the earthquakes occurred, the magnitude, and the depth from which that earthquake is generated. So it's interesting to look at that information. All of this is driven by the internal structure of the Earth. If we go right into the center of the Earth, we have a liquid core. And then as we move out towards the outer part of the Earth, the cools down, and we have obviously land on the surface, but magmas originating this, push in, and that's what drives the plate tectonics.